Rain fell over Bardstown in thin needling sheets, silver under the string lights strung across the iron gates of the Voss estate. Behind those gates, laughter rose in waves, champagne glasses ringing a string quartet threading through the wet night air, and on the far side of that sound, in the dark beyond the reach of the lanterns, Nathaniel stood soaked to the bone, watching a world he no longer had any claim to. He hadn't eaten in 2 days. His hands, once steady enough to sign contracts worth more than this entire town, now trembled faintly at his sides, curled into the sleeves of a jacket that wasn't his, pulled from a church donation bin, 3 towns back, 3 sizes too. Large, the collar frayed to threads. Underneath it, his ribs pressed sharp against skin gone thin and gray. He had learned these last weeks exactly how a body starts to consume itself when there is nothing left to give it. He had learned what it felt like to lie awake in the cold with his own heartbeat as the only proof he was still alive. Welcome to our YouTube channel. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch today's video. Before we begin, we would love to know where you are watching this video from. What time is it where you are right now, and which country are you joining us from? Is it the United States, the United Kingdom, France, Canada, or somewhere else in the world? Please leave a comment and share it with us. It would be truly wonderful if people from all around the world could connect with one another, share their stories and feelings, and spread kindness and love through every video. Thank you for becoming a part of our community. We hope you enjoy a meaningful, peaceful, and heartwarming time watching this video. He hadn't meant to come this close to the lights. Hunger had a way of pulling a man toward warmth the same way it pulled him toward food. He couldn't afford an animal logic that overruled everything he used to believe about dignity. He told himself he only wanted to stand near the wall a moment out of the wind before moving on into whatever darkness waited for him next. That was when the guard saw him. Hey, get away from the gate." The man's voice cut through the rain flat with contempt, the kind reserved for something you'd rather not look at too closely. He was broad-shouldered, dry under the gatehouse, awning a walkie-talkie clipped to his lapel, and an expression that had already decided everything it needed to know. "You lost, or did somebody actually let you wander this close to a $5,000 a plate party looking like that?" Nathaniel said nothing. 6 months ago, men like this one had waited outside boardrooms to open doors for him. Now the same species of face looked at him and saw nothing worth the effort of a second glance. "I asked you a question." The guard stepped forward, boots splashing through a puddle gone amber under the lanterns. "You smell like you slept in a dumpster. Get out of here before somebody important sees you and thinks we let trash wander the property." Trash. The word landed somewhere old and unhealed a place. Nathaniel thought he'd buried a long time ago. A place that remembered being 9 years old, standing outside a diner window in a coat, 2 sizes too small, watching other families eat, while a waitress waved him off the sidewalk like a stray. He had built an empire in part to make sure he never had to stand in that particular kind of cold again. And here it was, waiting for him anyway, patient as ever, as if it had simply known he'd come back around. "I'm leaving," Nathaniel said quietly. His voice came out rougher than he expected. Days of silence had worn the edges off it. "I don't want any trouble." "Good, because trouble's what you'll get." The guard's mouth curled, enjoying it now, the small cruelty of having someone smaller than him to correct. "Guys like you always got some sob story. Save it. This is a private event for people who actually built something with their lives. Go beg somewhere else." Built something. Nathaniel almost laughed, a short, broken sound that never made it past his throat. 3 months ago, his name had been on the cover of a business magazine, sitting on a table not 50 yards from where this man now stood, telling him what he had and hadn't built. 3 months ago, before the car went off the road on a rain-slicked stretch of highway outside Louisville. Before he understood exactly how far his own board of directors, people he'd trusted with, everything had been willing to go to make sure he never sat in that boardroom again. Before he learned that surviving meant becoming a man, no one would think twice about turning away from a gate. He didn't correct him. There was no version of the truth he could offer that wouldn't put a target back on his own spine. Behind the guard, past the wrought iron and the wet hedges trimmed into perfect rectangles, Nathaniel could see them, the party moving like something underwater, warm and gold and untouchable. A woman in a scarlet dress threw her head back, laughing at something he'd never hear. A man refilled a glass without looking at it the way people do when scarcity has never once crossed their mind. For one unbearable second, Nathaniel let himself remember what it felt like to stand inside rooms like that and not think about it at all, to complain about a bad quarter instead of wondering where he'd sleep. Then the wind shifted, carrying the smell of roasted lamb and candle wax out through the gate, and hunger closed over him again like a hand at his throat, and none of it mattered. "You deaf?" The guard took another step close enough now that Nathaniel could smell the coffee on his breath, see the small flecks of pleasure in his jaw. I said, "Move, or I make a call and you spend tonight somewhere a lot less comfortable than the sidewalk." Something distant swelled through the crowd behind him, a raised voice sharp enough to cut through even the quartet's music. A woman's voice furious and shaking, and beneath it a man's voice trying and failing to sound as if he had nothing to hide. Nathaniel couldn't make out the words. He only caught the shape of it: humiliation thrown like a blade across a crowded room, the particular sound of someone being discarded in front of people who used to call her a friend. For one strange moment, standing in the rain outside a gate that would never open for him, Nathaniel felt something twist quietly behind his ribs, not curiosity exactly, not yet, but something adjacent to it. A recognition. As if some part of him already understood long before he had any right to that whatever was happening on the other side of that hedge belonged to someone who knew exactly what it felt like to be looked at and found wanting. He didn't move toward it. He couldn't afford to be seen, not by security, not by cameras, not by anyone with a phone, and a reason to post his face somewhere the wrong people might see it. So he did the only thing left to a man with nothing. He stepped back into the dark, let the rain close over him again, and started walking, the guard's laughter trailing after him like something with teeth. He didn't look back at the lights. He told himself the ache in his chest was hunger and nothing more, because he'd learned in 6 brutal months that hope was the most dangerous thing a starving man could carry, and he had already sworn off carrying it. He had no way of knowing yet that a few miles down that same wet road, in a matter of hours, he would be bleeding into the dirt with his life narrowing down to a single choice, and that the same voice he'd just heard shatter behind it, head sharp and proud and refusing to be small, would be the one that found him there. Inside the gate, under a canopy strung with warm white bulbs that turned the falling rain to a curtain of gold, Grace Bennett stood very still in the middle of a room that had already decided she didn't belong in it. She had worn her one good dress navy plain, the hem let down twice over the years because she couldn't bring herself to replace it, and for the length of the drive over she had told herself this would be simple. 4 years of tuition, 4 years of double shifts at the clinic, and a second job waitressing on weekends, just to keep Caleb Hartman fed, housed, and enrolled while he chased a business degree neither of them could otherwise afford. She wasn't asking for anything that wasn't already hers. She had the numbers written on a folded piece of paper in her purse, because she'd always believed that if you told the truth plainly enough, people would have no choice but to hear it. She had not accounted for the way a room full of strangers could turn all at once like a single animal deciding what to devour. Caleb. Her voice, when she finally found him near the fountain, came out steadier than she felt. "It's me. I need to talk to you." He turned. For half a second so brief she would spend weeks afterward wondering if she'd imagined it, something flickered across his face that looked almost like the boy she remembered, the one who used to fall asleep at her kitchen table with a textbook open under his cheek while she counted out tip money to cover his lab fees. Then it was gone, smoothed over by something colder, something rehearsed. "I don't know this woman," Caleb said loud enough to carry. "I've never seen her before in my life." The words hit Grace somewhere just beneath the sternum, a blow with no visible mark. Around them, conversation dimmed by degrees as people turned to watch the way a crowd turns toward the smell of smoke before anyone has confirmed there's a fire. 4 years, Caleb. She kept her voice level, though her hands at her sides had begun to shake. 4 years I paid for your tuition, your books, your rent the semester you got laid off from the warehouse. Look at me. You know exactly who I am. You have the wrong guy. He glanced past her toward the woman crossing the lawn in a cream-colored gown, diamonds catching the string lights like small, deliberate accusations. "This is embarrassing. Please, just go home. Go home." As if home were still a place that had room for the version of herself she'd been before tonight. The one who believed love was a debt 2 people paid together, not one person quietly bled dry while the other learned to forget. "Adeline, ignore her." Caleb's voice dropped, urgent, now reaching for the woman's arm as she arrived at his side. "She's nobody. Let's go inside." Nobody. Something in Grace went very quiet and very clear, the way a held breath finally releases. "All right then." She turned, raising her voice so it carried across the terrace, across the fountain, across every manicured face now watching with the particular hunger people reserve for someone else's ruin. "A nobody wants her money back. Everyone here should know this man ate off my savings for 4 straight years. She's lying." Caleb's jaw tightened. "Security, someone get her out of here." "So this is the charity case." Adeline Voss stepped forward at last, cream silk trailing over the wet stone, her smile arranged with the precision of someone who had never once had to fight for anything, and had learned instead the far crueler art of taking. She looked Grace over slowly, the way you'd inspect something found on the bottom of a shoe. How rustic. Caleb, send her away before she embarrasses us both. You dare call me nobody after 4 years of your life eating off my paycheck. Grace's voice cracked, not with weakness but with something closer to fury finally allowed to surface. I came for what's mine, not a dollar more. Diane Voss arrived a moment later, drawn by the sudden hush, the way certain people are always drawn toward disorder, some instinct in them mistaking chaos for opportunity. She took in the scene with a single unhurried glance, the soaked hem of Grace's dress, the folded paper crushed now in her fist, the way half the terrace had gone silent to watch, and something in her expression sharpened, calculating, already 3 steps ahead of everyone else in the yard. What is this noise at my daughter's engagement? Diane's voice was cool, cultivated, the kind that had never once had to be raised to be obeyed. Who is this girl? Ask your future son-in-law, Grace said. He spent my savings and then forgot my face. A murmur moved through the crowd. Not sympathy. Not yet, only the low, electric thrill of scandal, the particular pleasure certain people take in watching someone else's dignity come apart in public. Give her something and get her off the property, Diane said finally, already turning away, already bored, as if Grace were a matter of logistics rather than a person standing in the rain asking to be seen. We are not having this conversation tonight. Caleb reached into his jacket, and for one unbearable second, Grace hoped some small, foolish part of her still hoped that he might finally do the decent thing. Instead, he withdrew a folded check, thick and heavy, with a number she refused to look at directly. Here. He didn't meet her eyes. Take it. Go back to wherever you came from and forget you ever knew this family. I didn't come to be bought. The words came out low, shaking but unbroken. I came for what's mine. This is more than your little clinic makes in a year, Diane said. Not unkindly, worse than unkindly, with the flat efficiency of someone closing an account. Be sensible. Grace looked at the check for a long moment. Then without a word she reached into her purse and drew out the folded paper. Instead, the real number, the honest one, tuition and rent, and lab fees added by hand over a kitchen table late at night. Years of quiet sacrifice reduced to a single sum. She held it up so the whole terrace could see it, and then deliberately she tore the check in half. Keep your extra, she said. I only came for what I actually spent. Not a coin more. I'm not a beggar. Just take it and go. Caleb said something almost like pleading, breaking through now, though. Whether it was for her sake or his own reputation, Grace could no longer tell. Laughter rose behind her as she turned to leave, bright, cruel, already reshaping the last hour into a story they'd tell at other parties. Did you see her counting out her little numbers on the lawn like it was a farmer's market? How pitiful. Grace didn't look back. She walked out through the iron gate into the rain, her good shoes ruined within 100 yards, the torn halves of the check dissolving to pulp in her closed fist. Somewhere behind the hedge line, past the reach of the lanterns, a figure in a soaked, oversized jacket watched her pass without knowing her name. Watched the particular way she held her spine straight, even as her shoulders shook, the way a person carries themselves when they have decided all at once that they will not be small for anyone's comfort ever again. Nathaniel didn't follow her. He told himself, walking the opposite direction into the dark toward wherever he'd sleep that night, that it wasn't his business, that he had nothing left to offer anyone, even if it had been. But the sound of her voice, I'm not a beggar, followed him down that wet road longer than he expected, lodging somewhere he thought hunger had long since hollowed out. He would think of it again hours later, in the last clear moment before the world went dark and red, and he understood distantly that he was bleeding into the mud with no one left to call. The rain had not let up by the time Grace reached the old distillery road, the one that cut behind the abandoned Kessler warehouses on the edge of town, its asphalt cracked and unlit for nearly 2 miles. She had taken it out of habit more than choice, the shorter way home, the way she'd driven 1,000 times, since her father first taught her to drive this same stretch in his rattling pickup truck, pointing out the old grain silos rusting against the tree line like the bones of something that used to matter. Tonight the road felt longer. Her hand still trembled faintly on the wheel, the adrenaline of the last hour draining out of her in slow, uneven waves, leaving behind something closer to exhaustion than anger. She had the radio off. She wanted only the sound of the wipers, the rhythm of something simple and mechanical, something that asked nothing of her. That was when she saw him. At first, her mind offered the easiest explanation, a shape in the ditch, a trash bag torn open by raccoons, nothing more. But the headlights swept wide on the bend, and caught something that was unmistakably a hand, fingers curled against wet gravel, and Grace's foot found the brake before her thoughts had finished catching up to what her eyes had already understood. She sat frozen for one full breath, engine idling, wipers ticking back and forth across a windshield gone silver with rain. Every instinct her mother had drilled into her as a girl. Don't stop on that road at night, Gracie. Not for anyone. Rose up at once, loud and reasonable, and entirely useless against the other thing rising beneath it. The thing that had made her a nurse in the first place. She got out of the car. The rain hit her immediately, cold enough to steal the breath from her chest, and she crossed the shoulder at a run, gravel biting through her ruined shoes. The man lay half in the ditch, half on the crumbling edge of the road, one arm flung out ahead of him as if he'd been crawling and simply run out of strength to keep going. Blood had soaked through the side of his jacket, the same oversized donation bin jacket he'd worn outside the Voss estate hours earlier. Though Grace had no way of knowing that, yet no way of knowing that the stranger bleeding into the Kentucky mud was the same silent figure who'd watched her walk away from that gate. Hey. Her voice came out rough, torn between fear and the flat, practiced calm she'd built over years of emergency shifts. Hey, can you hear me? Nothing. She dropped to her knees beside him, heedless of the mud soaking instantly through her one good dress, and pressed 2 fingers to his throat the way she'd done 1,000 times in the clinic, searching for the small, stubborn proof of her pulse. It was there, thready too fast, but there. Okay. She said it mostly for herself, a single word to hold the panic at arm's length. Okay, I've got you. Stay with me. Up close in the wash of her headlights, she could see more than she wanted to. He was painfully thin. Not the lean build of a man who ran or trained, but the hollowed-out thinness of someone who hadn't eaten properly in longer than a body could safely go without. His wrists, where the jacket sleeve had ridden up, looked almost breakable. Dark stubble covered a jaw gone gaunt, and beneath it, his skin held the gray undertone she recognized from 100 malnourished patients who'd come through her father's old clinic over the years, people who'd fallen through every net a small town had to offer. He's starving, she thought, and something in her chest twisted at the thought, an old grief surfacing before she could stop it. Her father's voice, decades gone, now the same words he used to say every time someone walked into his clinic looking like this. Nobody in this country should look like this, Gracie. Nobody. The wound at his side was worse. Not a fall, she understood immediately. Running trained fingers along the edge of torn fabric. The cut was too clean, too deliberate, and beneath the blood, she caught the telltale stippling of something that had come from a blade, not a rock or a branch. Someone had done this to him. No hospital. The words came out cracked, barely a whisper, and Grace startled backward, not realizing he'd surfaced into consciousness at all. His eyes had opened pale, glassy with pain and fever, fixed on her with an intensity that seemed to cost him everything he had left. Please. No hospital. You're losing blood, Grace said gently, though urgency sharpened underneath the calm. You need more than I can give you out here. Please. His hand closed weakly around her wrist, cold fingers trembling against her skin. They're looking for me. Anywhere but there. Something in his voice. Not the words themselves, but the naked terror beneath them. The particular fear of a man who had learned recently and thoroughly exactly what kind of people might be searching a hospital's admissions list. Made Grace go still. She had heard fear like that before in patients who'd fled situations she never asked too many questions about. She recognized it now the way she recognized a fracture beneath skin that hadn't yet begun to swell. She looked at him for a long moment, rain running down both their faces, his grip on her wrist weakening, even as his eyes begged her not to let go of the promise he was asking for. All right. She said it before she'd fully decided, to the way certain choices arrive already made, built from something deeper than reasoning. All right. Not the hospital. Relief moved through his face, fast and fragile, gone almost as soon as it appeared, as pain closed over him again. I'm going to get you up, Grace said already, working her shoulder under his arm, bracing her weight against his. On 3. 1, 2, up. He made a sound low in his throat, not quite a groan, more the sound of a man biting down against something far worse than he'd admit to. His legs barely held him, and for a moment they nearly went down together into the mud, Grace's arm the only thing between him and the ground. Lean on me, she said, steadier now, some old professional calm rising up beneath the fear. Small steps. I've got you. He did lean, and it startled her, the fact that he let himself. Whoever this man was, wherever he'd come from, he carried himself, even now half-conscious and bleeding, like someone unused to needing anyone. And yet here in the dark, with no one watching and no reputation left to protect, he allowed himself the smallest mercy of leaning his full weight into a stranger's shoulder. It took nearly 10 minutes to get him into the back seat of her car, the rain unrelenting the entire time, soaking them both to the bone. By the time Grace slid behind the wheel again, her hands shaking now for reasons that had nothing to do with the cold, he had gone quiet again, drifting at the edge of consciousness, his breathing shallow and uneven against the vinyl seat. She drove the rest of the way to her father's old clinic in silence, knuckles white on the wheel, throwing glances at the rearview mirror every few seconds to make sure his chest was still rising. The building sat dark and shuttered at the edge of town. The paint on its sign faded to a ghost of the words it once proudly displayed: Bennett, Family Clinic, free care for all who need it. A promise her father had kept until the day he died, with almost nothing to his name. She hadn't set foot inside in months. She hadn't been ready to. Tonight it seemed readiness was no longer a luxury either of them could afford. "Stay with me," Grace said again, more to herself than to him, cutting the engine outside the dark clinic doors. "Just a little longer. I've got you now." In the back seat, the stranger's eyes fluttered open one last time, finding hers in the mirror, with an expression she wouldn't understand the full weight of for weeks to come. Not simple gratitude, but something closer to disbelief, as if some deeply buried part of him had expected after everything never again to be looked at like he mattered. Then the darkness took him, and Grace was already moving, already reaching for the clinic keys with trembling hands, already stepping without knowing it into the first hour of a life neither of them would recognize by the time the sun came up. The clinic's back room still smelled the way Grace remembered it from childhood: antiseptic and old wood, a faint trace of her father's coffee grounds gone stale in a canister no one had thrown away. She hadn't turned on the overhead lights, afraid of what might be visible from the road, working instead by the glow of a single battery lantern she kept in her trunk for exactly this kind of emergency, though never one quite like this. She'd cut the stranger's shirt away with trauma shears, hands moving on old muscle memory even as her mind raced ahead of them. "Clean the wound. Stop the bleeding. Watch for shock. Don't let yourself think about how thin he is. Until later there will be time to think about that later." The cut along his ribs was deep, but had missed anything vital by what felt to Grace like the narrowest possible margin. She packed it, stitched it by lantern light, with hands that had gone steady the moment the work began, the way they always did, panic, burning off into pure procedure. It was only once the bleeding had slowed, once she'd covered him in the clinic's one remaining wool blanket, and pressed a cool cloth to a fever climbing steadily under her palm, that she allowed herself to really look at him. He was young, younger than she'd first guessed out on the road, maybe not much older than her, but hardship had aged him in ways that had nothing to do with years. His collarbones stood out sharp beneath skin gone thin as paper. There were old scars along one forearm, faded white lines that told a story she didn't ask about. And his hands, despite everything, despite the mud and the blood and the donation bin jacket now cut away and discarded on the floor, his hands were oddly careful, oddly precise, as if some deep-buried instinct in him still knew how to hold things gently even now. "Who did this to you?" she murmured, mostly to herself, dabbing at the fever sweat along his hairline. "Who's looking for you?" He didn't answer, couldn't, lost somewhere in the shallow, fevered space between sleeping and waking, but his lips moved anyway, murmuring fragments that made no sense to her at first. A name, a date that wasn't a date, just a season, the summer everything burned. The word fire repeated twice, low and anguished, like a wound reopening in his sleep that had nothing to do with the one in his side. Grace sat back on her heels, watching him, something uneasy stirring beneath her exhaustion. She told herself it was only fever talk, the kind that meant nothing, the mind static under stress. But something about the particular grief in his voice, not fear this time, but a much older, much deeper ache, made her lean closer, despite herself. "A boy," he whispered, eyes still closed, brow furrowed as if he were fighting his way back through something. "There was a boy. Pulled him out of the doctor pulled him out." Grace went very still. It wasn't the words themselves. It was the cadence of them, something achingly familiar. A phrase she hadn't heard spoken aloud in exactly this way since she was a girl of 9, sitting on the clinic's back steps, while her father told the story to a reporter from the county paper. The only time in his life he'd ever agreed to be written about. There was a fire out at the old Coleman distillery. A boy no more than 7-8 years old. I pulled him clear of it myself. Wouldn't take a dime for it. Some things you don't send a bill for. Coleman, Grace said aloud, testing the word like something fragile. "Did you say Coleman?" The stranger's eyes opened, fever bright, unfocused at first, then slowly, painfully sharpening on her face in the lantern light. For a long moment neither of them spoke. Rain ticked steadily against the clinic's boarded windows, the only sound in a silence that had suddenly become enormous. "How do you know that name?" he rasped. "My father," Grace said slowly, her own pulse climbing now, some instinct warning her she was standing at the edge of something she didn't yet have the shape of. "Dr. Bennett." He ran this clinic for 30 years. He used to tell a story about a fire out at an old distillery years and years ago. A little boy he pulled out of the wreckage. Said it was the one thing in his whole career he was proudest of, and he never once told anyone the boy's name, because he said it wasn't his story to tell. The stranger's face, already pale, already hollowed by fever and hunger, and whatever violence had put a blade in his side, went through something Grace had no name for. Not surprise exactly. Something closer to a wound reopening after decades of careful, deliberate scar tissue. That was me, he said finally, so quietly she nearly missed it beneath the rain. I was the boy. Grace felt the floor of the moment tilt beneath her the way it does when a piece of the past you thought was settled turns out to still be moving, still be alive, still capable of reaching forward through years to touch you. There was a fire at the distillery, he went on, each word coming slower, now dragged up from somewhere he clearly hadn't visited in a long time. My parents didn't make it out. I don't remember much. Smoke. Someone carrying me. A man's voice telling me to keep breathing, just keep breathing, over and over, all the way to the truck. His eyes found hers again, glassy with fever, and something that might have been tears, though it was hard to tell in the lantern light. He never sent a bill. My grandmother tried years later to pay him back for the burn treatment, the follow-up visits, all of it. He wouldn't take a cent. Said some things you don't send a bill for. That's exactly what he told, the reporter. Grace whispered, her own throat tightening now, decades of grief for a father long buried rising up unexpectedly in the dark of his own clinic. Word for word. The stranger closed his eyes. For a long moment he said nothing at all, and Grace watched something move across his face that she would only later understand as guilt, not for anything he'd done but for something he hadn't, some debt he'd carried silently, for far longer than she yet knew. There's something you should know, he said finally, voice barely above a whisper. About your clinic. About the last 6 years. Grace frowned, confusion cutting through the raw ache in her chest. What are you talking about? 6 years ago, this place was going to close. His words came slower now, effortful, each one costing him something. I know because I was the one who found out. A foundation, anonymous, routed through 3 different holding companies so no one could trace it back. Started covering the debt. The equipment. The malpractice insurance you couldn't otherwise afford. Every time this place came close to shutting its doors, something came through at the last possible moment. He swallowed, throat, working against the pain, against the fever, against something far harder to name. That was me, Grace. I've been the one keeping this place alive. Long before tonight. Long before I ever knew your face. The lantern flickered between them, throwing long shadows across the cracked linoleum, across the blanket, across a silence that had gone suddenly enormous. Grace sat frozen, every assumption she'd walked into this room carrying, that she had found a stranger that she had chosen out of nothing but her own conscience to save a man who owed her nothing, dissolving into something far stranger, far more disorienting, a debt repaid before she'd ever known it existed. A stranger who had, in some quiet, unseen way, already been standing beside her family for years. Why, she managed finally, her voice cracking around the single word, why would you do that? Why wouldn't you just tell someone? Tell me. His eyes, fever bright and exhausted, held hers with something raw and unguarded. A vulnerability she suspected he rarely allowed anyone to witness. Because some things, he whispered, echoing her father's own words back to her across 20 years in one burning building, you don't send a bill for. Outside, the rain had begun at last to soften, no longer the driving sheets of earlier, but something gentler, now steadier, the kind of rain that falls all night without hurry. Grace sat very still beside the stranger whose life she had just saved twice over, once tonight in the mud on the old distillery road, and once without either of them fully understanding it. Yet in every quiet act of keeping her father clinic alive across 6 years, neither of them had known. They shared. She didn't yet know his name. She wouldn't learn it, not the real one, not for weeks still to come. But something had already shifted in that small lantern-lit room, some current running beneath the fear and the fever and the blood-soaked bandages. Something that felt impossibly like recognition, like 2 broken halves of an old unfinished story finally finding their way back to the same room. Dawn arrived, reluctant and gray, filtering through the boarded windows in narrow bands that fell across the stranger's sleeping face like something almost tender. Grace hadn't slept. She'd spent the hours between midnight and first light in the hard plastic chair beside the exam table, changing his dressing twice more, watching the fever climb and finally mercifully begin to break somewhere around 4 in the morning. She'd told herself she was only doing what any nurse would do for anyone bleeding in a ditch. She had not yet found the words for what it meant that she hadn't once considered driving away and letting someone else find him instead. She was in the middle of boiling water on the clinic's ancient hot plate coffee for herself. Broth for him whenever he woke enough to keep it down when the knock came. Not a knock, really. 3 sharp raps against the clinic's front door, deliberate, unhurried. The kind of sound made by someone who expected to be let in rather than someone asking permission. Grace froze the kettle handle, still warm in her hand, every instinct in her body going taut at once. Through the frosted glass of the front door, she could make out 2 shapes, broad-shouldered, standing 2. Still too patient, the posture of men accustomed to being obeyed. Behind her in the back room, she heard the faint creak of the exam table. The stranger awake now, or close enough to it, going rigid beneath the wool blanket at the same sound that had frozen her in place. Grace. His voice came low, urgent, threading through the thin wall between them. "Don't answer it. It's my clinic," she whispered back, though her pulse had already begun to hammer. "If I don't answer, they'll think something's wrong." "Something is wrong," he said, and there was something in his tone now she hadn't heard yet. Not the delirious fear of the night before, but something colder, more controlled. A man calculating odds he'd clearly calculated before. "Those aren't cops. Cops don't dress like that. Cops don't stand like that." The knock came again, harder this time. Bennett Family Clinic. A man's voice, pleasant enough on its surface, the kind of pleasant that made the hair rise on the back of Grace's neck precisely because it was so carefully controlled. "We're looking for someone." A man, mid-30s, dark hair, possibly injured. "We have reason to believe he may have sought medical attention in this area last night." Grace's mind raced through every version of the next 30 seconds and found none of them safe. Lie and risk whatever these men were capable of if they searched the building anyway. Tell the truth and hand a wounded, terrified stranger back to whoever had already tried once to kill him. She thought of her father of 30 years spent in this building, turning away no one who came to his door in need, no matter what trouble followed them in. She thought of the word he'd used, the one the stranger had repeated back to her in the dark: "Some things you don't send a bill for." She crossed to the door and opened it only as far as the chain allowed. "I'm sorry, I don't know what you're talking about," she said, and was faintly amazed at how level her own voice came out. "I've been alone here all night doing inventory. Haven't had a patient through that door in 3 days." The taller of the 2 men studied her for a long moment, eyes moving past her shoulder into the dim hallway behind, searching for anything that might contradict her. "You live alone here, ma'am?" "I live 2 miles up the road." She kept her chin level, refusing to let her eyes drift toward the back room even once, though every nerve in her body screamed to check on him. "This is a free clinic. We don't get much traffic these days. State cut half our funding last year. Mind if we take a look inside?" And this was the moment later that Grace would return to again and again in memory, turning it over like a stone worn smooth from handling. Because in the half-second before she could answer, a voice spoke up behind her, closer than she expected, steadier than it had any right to be given the fever that had gripped him only hours earlier. "Is there a problem, officers?" The stranger stood in the hallway behind her, upright, barely one hand braced against the doorframe to hide the tremor. Grace alone could see, wearing an old flannel shirt she'd found in her father's closet, buttoned crookedly sleeves, rolled to hide the fresh bandage beneath. His voice had changed entirely from the fevered whisper of the night before. Something in the set of his shoulders and the flat authority of his tone made even the taller stranger at the door hesitate. "And you are the man asked?" "Her husband." The words came out without a flicker of hesitation, smooth as something long rehearsed, though Grace knew with absolute certainty that he was inventing it in real time, gambling everything on a single sentence. "We got in late from her sister's place in Elizabethtown. Whatever this is about, we'd appreciate you telling us so we can help, or letting us get back to our morning." Grace felt her own pulse stutter at the word husband, spoken with such casual, unshakable conviction that for a fraction of a second even she nearly believed it herself. The 2 men exchanged a glance, some silent calculation passing between them. "Apologies for the intrusion," the taller one said finally, though his eyes lingered a beat too long on the stranger's face, cataloging something Grace couldn't read. "If you do happen to see anyone matching that description, there's a number you can call. Substantial reward for information." "We'll keep an eye out," the stranger said evenly. They left without another word, boots crunching over wet gravel toward a black SUV, parked at an angle across the clinic's small lot. Grace didn't move until the engine turned over, and the vehicle pulled away down the Distillery Road taillights, shrinking into the gray morning. Only then did the stranger's legs give out. She caught him before he hit the floor, his full weight sagging into her shoulder the way it had on the roadside the night before, breath coming hard and shallow now that the performance was over, and there was nothing left holding him. Upright, but adrenaline burning off all at once. "That was reckless," Grace said, easing him down into the hallway chair, her voice caught somewhere between fury and something gentler she didn't yet have a name for. You could barely stand. They were going to search the building either way. His voice had dropped back to something rougher, more honest, stripped of the smooth authority from moments before. A woman living alone with a stranger in the back room, that's a story worth pulling apart. A married couple minding their own business isn't. You just told 2 armed men were married. I know. He looked up at her then, and something in his expression, exhaustion layered over something raw, something almost apologetic, made the anger drain out of her before she could hold on to it properly. I'm sorry. It was the only thing I could think of fast enough to keep them from opening every door in this building. Grace studied him for a long moment in the pale morning light. The hollows beneath his eyes, the tremor he was fighting to keep from his hands, the careful, deliberate way he held himself even now, even exhausted, like a man who had spent a long time learning never to let anyone see exactly how much something cost him. Who are you? She said quietly. Not really a question anymore. More a statement of everything she still didn't know. Who's looking for you like that? Someone who wants what I used to have. His eyes drifted briefly toward the boarded window, toward the gray Kentucky morning beyond it. The less you know, Grace, the safer you stay. I mean that. You know my name. You told the men at the door, he said, and the ghost of something almost like a smile crossed his face, quickly smothered by exhaustion. I've got a good memory for the things worth remembering. She wanted badly to press further, to demand every answer, to understand exactly what danger she'd just lied her way into protecting. But something in the careful, guarded way he held her gaze told her the truth would come only when he was ready to survive, giving it to her, and not a moment before. Rest, she said, instead reaching to steady him as he swayed slightly in the chair. We'll figure out the rest later. Grace. He caught her wrist gently as she turned to go, his grip weak but insistent. Thank you. For not opening that door the way they wanted. She looked down at his hand around her wrist, careful, deliberate, the same unexpected gentleness she'd noticed the night before in the mud, and felt something shift quietly inside her, some current she wasn't yet ready to name, running beneath fear and exhaustion, and a stranger's borrowed title still hanging unclaimed in the morning air between them. Don't thank me yet, she said softly. You called yourself my husband. You have no idea how much trouble that word is about to cause both of us. Weeks passed in careful, quiet increments, the kind that leave no single dramatic mark but somehow taken together, rebuild a person from the ground up. The stranger, Grace, had started calling him Nate, a name he'd offered without explanation one morning over coffee, and she'd learned not to ask what it was short for. Regained weight, slowly color, returning to a face that had been gray with hunger the night she'd found him. He'd taken to sleeping in the clinic's old supply room, insisting he needed nothing more than a cot and a locked door, though Grace suspected the choice had less to do with comfort and more to do with a man who still even now kept one eye on every exit in a room. He never left during daylight. He helped where he could without being seen, restocking shelves after dark, fixing the clinic's ancient boiler with hands that clearly knew more about machinery than a night guard's salary would ever explain. Though Grace chose for now not to ask about that either, there was an unspoken agreement growing between them, patient, as the healing of his ribs she wouldn't push, and in exchange he was slowly, unevenly, letting her closer than he seemed to have let anyone in a very long time. It was a Tuesday evening, though neither of them marked it that way anymore. Days blurring into a single continuous act of quiet survival, when Grace found him sitting on the clinic's back steps, the same steps where she used to sit as a girl, while her father saw the evening's last patients. The Kentucky sky had gone that particular shade of orange-blue that comes just before full dark, cicadas rising in a slow chorus from the tall grass beyond the parking lot. You're supposed to be resting that shoulder, she said, easing down beside him close enough to feel the warmth radiating off him. After a day spent moving crates he had no business moving. I've done worse to it, he said, and something in his voice made her look over, not pain exactly, but the particular flatness of a man skating past a subject he had no intention of landing on. They sat in silence for a while, the kind that had become comfortable between them, neither needing to fill it. Then, without any visible decision to do so, he began to speak, his voice low, almost as if he were telling the story to the darkening tree line rather than to her. There was a fire, he said. You already know that part. What you don't know is what happened after. Grace went very still, sensing the fragility of whatever was about to be handed to her, careful not to move too quickly and startle it back into silence. I don't remember my parents' faces, he continued. Not really. I was too young, and grief has a way of erasing the details first, keeping only the shape of the loss. What I remember is the years after. Foster homes. 6 of them by the time I turned 18, most of them fine. A couple of them, not none of them, Anything close to what people mean when they say the word family. He turned the flannel cuff of his sleeve between his fingers, an old, unconscious habit Grace had noticed before without understanding it. You learn things moving through houses like that. You learn not to unpack your bag all the way because you might be moving again inside a month. You learn not to get used to anyone caring whether you eat dinner because the person who cared this month might not be the person signing your paperwork next month. Nate, Grace said softly. You don't have to, I want to, he said, and something in the quiet insistence of it stopped her. I've never told anyone this, not the whole of it. I think I need to say it out loud to someone just once and see if it still has the same weight when it's not just living inside my own head. She nodded and waited. By the time I was in my 20s, I'd built something, he went on. Not out of ambition exactly, out of fear. If you have enough money, enough success, no one can move you out of a house again without your say-so. No one can look at you the way people looked at a foster kid with second-hand shoes. I told myself that was the whole reason I worked as hard as I did. I told myself once I had enough, the fear would finally stop. Did it, for a while. A faint, humorless smile touched his mouth. Long enough to convince myself I'd actually fixed something. I was engaged years back. A good woman, or she, seemed like one smart, ambitious, seemed to understand the world I'd built for myself. And then rumors started. Nothing confirmed, just whispers that my company might be vulnerable, that certain people were circling looking for weakness to exploit. His jaw tightened. She was gone within the week. Didn't even wait to see if the rumors were true. Packed up, left a note, moved on to someone whose stock wasn't shaking. Grace felt something ache in her chest on his behalf. An old, familiar grief she recognized from her own life dressed in different clothes. That's not on you, she said quietly. That's on her. Maybe. He looked out at the darkening tree line, something distant and old moving behind his eyes. But it confirmed something I'd suspected since I was a boy, sitting in a stranger's kitchen wondering how long I'd get to stay this time. That love, real or otherwise, has a shelf life tied to how useful or stable you look to the person offering it. That the moment things get uncertain, people leave. Every time, without exception in my experience, until he stopped himself, jaw working, as if the next words cost him more than he'd budgeted for. Until what, Grace asked gently. He turned to look at her fully then, and something raw moved across his face, unguarded in a way she hadn't yet seen from him. Not the careful composure of the man who'd lied to armed strangers at her front door with perfect practiced calm, but something younger, something closer to the boy, who'd once been pulled from a burning building by a doctor who wouldn't take a dime for it. Until a woman found me bleeding out in a ditch, he said, and instead of driving to the nearest hospital and washing her hands of the whole thing, she brought a stranger into her father's clinic, lied to armed men at her own front door to protect him, and hasn't once asked me for anything in return. His voice roughened. I don't know what to do with that, Grace. I've spent almost 20 years building walls around exactly this kind of vulnerability, and you've been quietly taking them apart without even trying. Grace's throat tightened, old grief and new tenderness tangling together until she couldn't easily separate them. My father used to say something, she said finally, when she trusted her voice again. He said the people who give without expecting anything back are usually the ones who understand best what it costs to have nothing. He gave away 30 years of care to people who couldn't pay him a cent, and he died with almost nothing in the bank. Some people thought that made him a fool. She shook her head slowly. I think it made him the richest man I ever knew. He sounds like he was Nate, said quietly. He was. She let the silence hold for a moment, the cicadas rising and falling in the tall grass, the last light draining slowly out of the sky above the old distillery road. I'm not trying to fix whatever's broken in you, Nate. I don't think that's something one person can do for another, not really. But I can tell you this, I'm not going anywhere the moment things get complicated. I've already seen the worst of what people can do to each other tonight. I watched a man I gave 4 years of my life to deny he'd ever met me in front of an entire crowd without so much as blinking. Whatever you're carrying doesn't scare me off. It just makes me understand you a little better. He didn't answer right away. When he finally did, his voice had gone rough in a way that had nothing to do with his healing ribs. I don't know how to be loved without waiting for it to end, he admitted. I don't know if I remember how. Then we'll figure it out slowly, Grace said, and reached over without quite deciding to still his restless hand where it worried at his sleeve. There's no rush. Nobody's leaving tonight. He looked down at her hand over his for a long moment, something in his shoulders loosening by degrees, some old exhausted vigilance, setting itself down just slightly for the first time in longer than he could remember. Above them, the first stars had begun to surface through the fading Kentucky twilight, and neither of them moved to go back inside for a long while after that content, simply to sit together in the dark, two people who had each in their own, separate ways spent a long time learning how to survive alone, and who were only now beginning cautiously to consider what it might mean to stop. Morning came to the Bennett family clinic with a kind of purpose it hadn't held in over a year. Grace stood in the front room before sunrise, sleeves rolled to her elbows, wiping 2 decades of dust from glass cabinets that had sat mostly empty since her father's funeral. Sunlight, when it finally broke through the blinds, fell in long gold bars across a floor she'd swept 3 times already, as if the act of cleaning could somehow settle the restlessness that had taken root in her chest since the night on the back steps. She hadn't planned to reopen the clinic. For months after her father died, she'd told herself it was temporary, that the doors would open again, once she'd sorted the paperwork, once grief loosened its grip enough to let her walk back into a building so thoroughly haunted by his absence. But temporary had stretched into a year, and a year had stretched into something that felt some mornings like it might simply become permanent. It had taken a stranger bleeding into her back seat to remind her what these rooms were actually for. "You're going to wear a hole in that counter," Nate said from the doorway. A crate of donated supplies balanced against his hip bandages and gauze from the church drive he'd quietly arranged through channels. Grace still didn't fully understand. Careful, never to let his own name attach to any of it. "Better the counter than my sanity." She straightened, pressing a hand to the small of her back. "I forgot how much work this place is without someone to split it with." Something flickered across his face, not quite a smile, but close to one, the particular expression of a man unused to being included in someone else's plans and still working out how it felt. "Well," he said, setting the crate down carefully, "you've got someone now. For as long as that's useful to you." Grace didn't answer right away, busying herself with the crate instead of meeting his eyes, aware of how much weight had settled quietly into that sentence. A few weeks later, the clinic reopened its doors to the town, and Bardstown in its own cautious way began to trickle back through them. An elderly man with a stubborn cough who hadn't seen a doctor in 3 years because he couldn't afford one. A young mother with a feverish toddler on her hip, relief written plain across her face at the small hand-lettered sign in the window. "Free care for all who need it." The same words her father had painted decades before, the paint now refreshed by Grace's own careful hand. Word moved fast in a town this size. Within a month, the waiting room, 4 mismatched chairs and a coffee table stacked with magazines older than some of the patients, rarely sat empty for long. Grace worked double what any reasonable person would call a full day, and found to her own quiet surprise that she'd never felt less exhausted doing it. Nate stayed close, though never visible during clinic hours, disappearing into the back room or the old boiler closet whenever the bell above the door announced a new patient. It was a careful choreography they'd built together without ever discussing it outright. His presence a secret the whole town would eventually need to be protected from, though neither of them spoke often of what exactly they were. Protecting him from or for how long the arrangement could reasonably hold. In the evenings, once the last patient had gone and the sign had been flipped to closed, something else had begun as well, quieter, slower, unfolding in the space between clinic hours and midnight. Grace had enrolled almost on impulse in the night classes offered at the community college 2 towns over, chasing the nursing certification she'd set aside years earlier, when the money for tuition had gone instead toward putting someone else through school. She told herself it was practical. She told herself the clinic needed a fully certified nurse if it was going to survive long-term on grant money and goodwill alone. She didn't tell herself, not out loud, that some part of her wanted to prove to herself, if to no one else, that she could build something of her own after 4 years spent quietly building someone else's future instead. "You don't have to do this," Nate said one evening, watching her pack a battered canvas bag with textbooks at the kitchen table of the small apartment above the clinic, where she'd insisted over his protests that he take the spare room rather than keep sleeping on a cot in the supply closet. "The clinic runs fine as it is." "It runs," Grace agreed, not looking up from the bag. "It doesn't run well. I've been improvising off half-finished training for 2 years. If I'm going to keep this place alive the way my father did, I need to actually know what I'm doing, not just guess well under pressure." "You guess well under pressure," he said, something warm threading through the words. "I've seen it firsthand. Guessing gets people killed eventually," she said simply. "I'd rather know." He watched her a moment longer, something unreadable moving behind his eyes, and then said almost too quietly to catch, "I could pay for it. The classes. All of it. It wouldn't be a fraction of what I know." The word came out sharper than she intended, and she softened it with a glance up at him, gentler this time. "Nate, I appreciate it. I do. But I need this one to be mine, Every dollar, every late night, every exam I fail before I pass it. I spent 4 years pouring everything I had into somebody else's future and getting nothing back but a door slammed in my face. I'm not doing that again, even with someone I trust. Something in his expression shifted. Not hurt exactly, but a kind of quiet respect, settling into place, the look of a man recalibrating everything he thought he understood about generosity and what it could and couldn't fix. Understood, he said. I won't offer again. You can drive me though, she said, allowing herself a small smile as she zipped the bag closed. The truck's making that noise again and it's a long walk in the dark. I can do that, he said, and something in his voice, in the careful, deliberate way he said it, told her. The offer meant more to him than she probably understood. A small, ordinary act of usefulness, of being needed for something as simple as a ride through the dark, after a lifetime spent being valued, mostly for what he could provide from a distance in dollar amounts, never in person. That night, driving the 2-lane road toward the community college headlights cutting through a darkness dense with cicada song, Nate glanced over at her more than once, the set of her jaw as she reviewed flashcards by the dashboard. Light, the particular stubbornness in the way she mouthed anatomical terms under her breath, refusing to let herself get anything less than exactly right. What she said finally catching him looking. Nothing. He returned his eyes to the road, though the faint smile hadn't left his face. Just my mother wanted to be a nurse. Before the fire. I don't remember much about her, but I remember that. Grace's flashcard stilled in her lap. You've never mentioned her before. I don't usually. He was quiet a moment, the truck's headlights sweeping over the dark tree line. It's strange. Watching you do this, build something out of almost nothing. Refuse help even when it would make things easier just because you want it to be entirely your own. It feels like watching a piece of her I never got to know. I think she would have liked you. Grace didn't trust her voice enough to answer right away. She reached over instead and rested her hand briefly against his on the gear shift, the gesture saying what neither of them seemed ready yet to put into words. By the time they reached the parking lot outside the squat brick building where her classes were held, the fear that had followed both of them for weeks, the men at the gate, the wound still healing beneath his shirt, the life he'd left and behind and hadn't yet found a way back into, safely had, for one small stretch of highway, receded just far enough to let something gentler take its place. I'll be here at 9, Nate said as she gathered her bag, waiting right outside. You don't have to. I know, he said simply. I want to. She smiled. A real one. Unguarded, the kind she hadn't allowed herself in longer than she could easily remember, and stepped out into the cool Kentucky night, walking toward a building full of strangers and a future entirely her own, while behind her in the quiet of the parked truck Nate watched her go with an expression that had nothing left in it, of the careful, guarded man who'd once told armed strangers at a locked door that he had nothing left worth protecting. The knock at the clinic's back door came just after midnight, 3 short raps followed by a pause, and one more, a pattern Nate recognized instantly, his whole body going still at the kitchen table where he'd been nursing a cup of black coffee waiting for Grace's class to let out. He crossed to the door and opened it to find Marcus Doyle standing on the step, rain-damp and travel-worn, a duffel bag slung over one shoulder, and an expression that had clearly been rehearsing this conversation the entire drive. Down from Louisville. You look like hell, warmed over Marcus said, stepping past him into the kitchen without waiting for an invitation, the easy familiarity of 20-some years of friendship written into every line of his posture, which I guess is an improvement considering the last photo I got of you looked like you'd already died. Good to see you too. Nate closed the door behind him, checking the street once out of old habit before he did. How'd the supply run go? Clean. Nobody followed me, if that's what you're asking. Marcus dropped the duffel onto a kitchen chair and turned to face him fully, and whatever warmth had been in his voice a moment ago hardened into something else entirely. Which is more than I can say for whatever's going on with you and this nurse. Nate's jaw tightened. Her name is Grace. I know her name, Nate. I know a lot more about her than you probably think I do, because unlike you, I've actually been doing my job this whole time, which is keeping you alive. Marcus pulled out the chair and sat rubbing a hand over his tired face. You've been in this town 6 weeks. You've let a civilian in on the fact that you're not dead, which need. I remind you, every board member at Coleman Bourbon currently believes to be a settled matter. You've got Voss Enterprises people canvassing every clinic and hospital within 50 miles, and instead of staying invisible like we agreed, you're driving her to night classes like some kind of, I don't even know what to call it. She saved my life, Nate said quietly. She lied to 2 of Diane Voss's men standing in her own doorway to protect me. She's put herself at risk for weeks now and never once asked what's in it for her. That you know of. Marcus's voice sharpened. Nate, listen to me. I've seen this before. I watched it happen to you once already, remember? The second things looked shaky with the company. Vanessa was gone within a week. And that was a woman who actually knew who you were, who'd had years to decide whether she loved the man or the number attached to him. This one doesn't even know your real name yet, and you're already handing her pieces of your life you haven't handed anyone in a decade. The words landed harder than Marcus probably intended, old grief surfacing in Nate's chest before he could stop it. This is different. It's always different right up until it isn't. Marcus leaned forward, elbows on the table, his voice dropping into something less combative and more genuinely afraid. I'm not trying to be cruel. I'm trying to keep you breathing. You have no idea what she does. The second she finds out Nate Cole is actually Nathaniel Coleman, worth more money than this entire county will see in 100 years. People change, Nate. Money changes the math on people every single time. I've watched it happen enough times to stop being surprised by it. She turned down my money, Nate said. I offered to pay for her classes outright. She said no. Said she needed this one thing to be entirely hers. Marcus paused at that, something flickering across his face, not quite doubt in his own position, but close to it, quickly smothered. Anyone can say no to money once, especially if they suspect there's more coming, if they play it patient. That's not who she is. You've known her 6 weeks. I've known plenty of people for years who turned out to be exactly what everyone warned me about, Nate said, quieter now, something raw threading through the words. And I've known her for 6 weeks who's done nothing but prove the opposite over and over, with nothing to gain from it that I can find. At some point, Marcus, the evidence has to count for something. Marcus studied him for a long moment, and Nate could see the old friend underneath the bodyguard, the boy he'd grown up with in a system that hadn't been kind to either of them, weighing loyalty against fear in a way that had kept Nate alive more than once over the years. I'm not saying she's lying, Marcus said finally, some of the fight draining out of his voice, replaced by something more tired, more honest. I'm saying I watched what happened to you the last time you let your guard down, and I am not interested in watching it happen twice. You've got a company still fighting for its life, a board that thinks you're dead, and people with real money and real motive, actively looking for you right now. This is not the moment to fall in love with a stranger you met bleeding in a ditch. I didn't say I was falling in love with her. You didn't have to. Marcus's voice softened just slightly, the exhaustion of a long drive and a longer worry finally showing through. I've known you since we were 9 years old, sharing a bunk bed in a house that didn't want either of us. I know what your face does when you've stopped protecting yourself around someone. I haven't seen that face in years, Nate. Not since before Vanessa, and it scares the hell out of me because the last time I saw it, it cost you almost everything. The kitchen fell, quiet rain, ticking steadily against the window, the old refrigerator humming in the silence between them. Nate looked down at his coffee, gone cold, now untouched for the length of the conversation. What do you want me to do? He said finally. Push her away. Disappear again before she can find out any more than she already knows. I want you to be careful, Marcus said. That's all. I'm not asking you to abandon her. I'm asking you to remember that you're still hunted, still hiding, and still the single most valuable target Diane Voss has been looking for in months. Anything that gets close to you right now becomes a liability to her too, whether either of you wants that or not. If Voss ever connects the two of you, it won't just be your life on the line. It'll be hers. That landed differently than anything else Marcus had said. Not an accusation of grace, but a warning about the cost of loving her, a danger Nate hadn't fully let himself consider in the quiet, careful weeks of building something gentle, in the middle of so much wreckage. I hear you, Nate said, finally, voice low. I'll be more careful. That's all I'm asking. Marcus stood gathering his duffel, some of the tension easing from his shoulders now that the words had finally been said aloud. For what it's worth, I hope I'm wrong about her. I really do. You deserve to be wrong about this one, if any version of this is ever going to end well for you. You'll see, Nate said quietly though. Even as he said it, Marcus's warning had already settled into a corner of his chest. He couldn't fully shake old fear, familiar and well-worn, rising up despite every piece of evidence stacked against it. Outside headlights swept briefly across the kitchen window. Grace's borrowed ride home from class arriving a few minutes early, and Nate rose from the table, aware in a way he hadn't quite let himself be before tonight of exactly how much he now stood to lose and how little control he had left over, whether he'd be allowed to keep it. 3 towns over, in a rented studio apartment above a laundromat that smelled permanently of bleach and burnt coffee, Caleb Hartman sat hunched over a second-hand laptop at 2 in the morning, doing the only kind of work left to a man who'd been quietly erased from every version of his own future, within a matter of weeks. The Voss family had cut him loose within days of the scene at the gate, Not officially, not with any announcement, but in the quiet, deliberate way people like Diane Voss dismantled things they no longer found useful. His job offer at Voss Enterprises, the one Madison had promised, would be waiting for him the moment the engagement was finalized, evaporated without explanation. His calls to Madison went unanswered, then straight to voicemail, then eventually to a number that had apparently been changed altogether. The apartment he'd been renting on the strength of that promised salary was 2 months behind, the landlord's notices piling up unread on the kitchen counter beside a stack of unpaid credit card statements. He told himself some nights that none of it was his fault, that Grace had humiliated him in front of the people who mattered, that her outburst at the gate had cost him everything he'd spent years building toward. Other nights, in the particular clarity that comes at 2 in the morning when a man has run out of anyone left to blame but himself, he understood exactly whose choices had put him here. Neither version of the truth put food in his refrigerator. He'd taken freelance work where he could find it, data entry background checks for a private investigation firm, 2 counties over, that didn't ask too many questions about references, anything that kept the lights on, while he searched with mounting desperation for some way back into Madison, Voss's good graces. It was during one of these jobs, cross-referencing old security footage for an insurance claim that had nothing to do with him personally, that he first saw the face. It came up almost by accident, a still frame pulled from a warehouse camera near the old Kessler Distillery District, time-stamped from 6 weeks earlier, grainy and half-obscured by rain. A man gaunt and soaked, moving quickly through the frame's edge before vanishing out of range. Caleb wouldn't have looked twice at it if something in the man's bearing hadn't snagged at a memory he couldn't quite place, the particular way he carried his shoulders upright even in obvious distress, like a man unaccustomed to being looked down on despite every visible sign that he currently deserved to be. Caleb sat back from the laptop, frowning, some old instinct nagging at him. He'd seen that face somewhere before, not recently, not in this ruined, hollowed-out version, but somewhere polished, somewhere important. It took him the better part of an hour scrolling back through old business news archives on his phone before the memory surfaced fully. Forbes. A profile from years back, one of those glossy features on self-made success stories that used to circulate through his business school classes as inspiration. Nathaniel Coleman, Bourbon's Boy Wonder, the headline had read above, a photograph of a younger, healthier version of the same face he'd just seen ducking through warehouse security footage in the rain. Founder of Coleman Bourbon Co., self-made billionaire, orphaned young, built an empire from a single-family distillery into one of the largest independent bourbon operations in the country. Presumed dead, according to the last news cycle Caleb could find on the subject, a car accident on a rain-slicked highway outside Louisville. Months back, the company's stock cratering on the news before quietly stabilizing under new interim leadership. Caleb stared at the screen for a long time, his heart beginning to pound with something that felt uncomfortably close to hope. If he's alive, he thought, the calculation forming almost against his will, if he's actually alive and hiding somewhere in this county, then whoever finds him first isn't just sitting on a story. They're sitting on leverage worth more money than I've ever seen in my life. He told himself at first that he was only curious, that the resemblance was probably a coincidence, a trick of exhaustion and desperation manufacturing patterns where none existed. But the more he dug, cross-referencing the timestamp against local hospital admission records, against gas station receipts, against the sparse handful of grainy camera angles he could pull from the county's aging surveillance network, the clearer the picture became. A man matching Nathaniel Coleman's description had been spotted more than once in the immediate vicinity of the old Bennett family clinic. Caleb's hands went still over the keyboard. He knew that clinic. Everyone in this part of the county knew that clinic, if not by name, then by reputation, the free clinic that had reopened a few months back. The one run by Grace Bennett, driving in and out of town at odd hours in her father's old truck. His stomach turned over slowly, some ugly, uneasy recognition rising up beneath the excitement. Of course it would be her clinic. Of course, somehow, in a town this small, the 2 threads of his ruined life would find some way to tangle back together. He pulled up a satellite image of the property, studying it for a long moment, turning the possibilities over with the same cold calculation he'd once applied to spreadsheets in his business classes, before grief and shame had a chance to catch up with the thought and slow it down. If it's true, he told himself, if Nathaniel Coleman really is hiding out at Grace's clinic under some assumed name, then I'm not just holding a rumor. I'm holding something Diane Voss would pay almost anything to know. He thought of Madison's face at the engagement party, the particular cold amusement she'd worn watching Grace get humiliated in front of the crowd. He thought of the unanswered calls, the changed number, the slow, deliberate erasure of every promise that had once seemed solid enough to build a future on. He told himself this wasn't about revenge. He told himself it was simply business information, had value, and he happened to be sitting on something valuable, and a man in his position couldn't afford the luxury of scruples he'd never fully possessed in the first place. He didn't let himself think not fully about what it might mean for Grace if he was right. He didn't let himself think about the years she'd spent working double shifts to put him through school, the quiet, unglamorous sacrifices that had built the very future he was now preparing to trade away for a chance at reinstatement. He'd gotten very good these last months at not thinking about things that made the calculation harder than it needed to be. By 4 in the morning, he drafted the message 3 separate times, deleting and rewriting each version until the wording sat exactly right: professional, discreet, valuable enough to guarantee a response, but careful enough not to reveal his full hand before he'd secured something in return. Miss Voss, the final draft began. I believe I have information regarding a matter your family has significant interest in locating. I'd like to discuss terms before sharing further details. His finger hovered over the send button for a long moment, the cursor blinking in the gray pre-dawn light of the apartment, the laundromat's ventilation fan humming faintly below him through the floor. Somewhere in that hesitation, some last remaining thread of the man Grace had once believed was worth 4 years of her savings surfaced briefly, asking whether this was really a door he wanted to walk through. Then he thought of his empty refrigerator, of the unpaid notices piling up on the counter of Madison's unanswered calls, and the life he'd been promised and had watched dissolve within days of a single humiliating scene at a gate, and the hesitation passed. He pressed send. Somewhere across town, in the small apartment above her father's clinic, Grace slept peacefully beside a man she had begun cautiously to trust with more of herself than she'd offered anyone in years, unaware that miles away the last thread, connecting her old life to her new one, had just quietly, deliberately sold the single secret capable of destroying everything they'd built. Diane Voss read the message twice before she allowed herself to feel anything at all. She sat alone in her study, the house quiet around her at this late hour, the only light, a single desk lamp throwing a narrow circle across the mahogany surface where she'd built over 3 decades an empire founded on precisely this kind of patient, ruthless calculation. She read the words a third time: information regarding a matter your family has significant interest in locating, and felt something settle into place behind her ribs, cold and satisfied. The particular pleasure of a woman who had learned long ago that patience was simply violence given enough time to arrange itself properly. She didn't respond immediately. She let the silence stretch for a full day, long enough to remind whoever had sent this message exactly whose position of power they were negotiating from, before finally arranging a meeting at a diner 2 counties over neutral ground cash. Only the kind of place where no camera would think to look twice at either of them. Caleb arrived early, nervous in a way he tried and failed to disguise, turning his coffee cup in slow circles on the formica table while he waited. You said you had information, Diane said, sliding into the booth across from him without preamble, her voice carrying the same cool, cultivated authority she'd used to dismiss Grace at the gate months earlier. I don't have patience for wasted time, Mr. Hartman. Speak plainly. There's a man staying at the Bennett family clinic, Caleb said, forcing his voice steady. Been there for weeks. Goes by Nate. Keeps out of sight during the day, works nights, avoids cameras whenever he can. I ran his face against some old business archives, and he paused, some last flicker of hesitation crossing his features before ambition overrode it entirely. I'm fairly confident it's Nathaniel Coleman. Alive. Diane's expression didn't change, though something behind her eyes sharpened considerably, the flat stillness of a predator recalculating the exact size and shape of an opportunity. You're certain? As certain as I can be without walking up and asking him directly. And what Diane said slowly, do you want in exchange for this certainty? Caleb's throat worked. My position back. The one Madison promised before everything fell apart at the party. Diane studied him for a long, unhurried moment, the particular contempt of someone who had never once in her life needed to trade away a scrap of dignity for a paycheck, appraising a man who clearly had. Consider it done, she said finally, assuming your information proves accurate. She rose from the booth, smoothing her coat, already 3 steps ahead of him in a plan Caleb had no possible way of understanding the full shape of. You've been more useful than you realize, Mr. Hartman. What Caleb didn't know, what he would never fully understand even months later, once the whole architecture of what he'd stumbled into finally came crashing down around everyone involved, was that Diane Voss had been waiting for exactly this news for the better part of a year. Voss Enterprises' hostile bid for Coleman Bourbon Co. had stalled the moment Nathaniel Coleman's death was declared. Tangled in probate proceedings, and a board of directors too cautious to sell, while questions still lingered around the founder's disappearance. A living Nathaniel Coleman, quietly located and properly dealt with once and for all, would clear every remaining obstacle standing between Diane and full control of the largest independent bourbon operation left in the state. She didn't tell Caleb any of that. She simply thanked him, promised to be in touch, and walked out into the parking lot already dialing a number. Caleb would never see already setting into motion something far darker than the simple leverage he imagined he'd sold her. That same week, miles away and entirely unaware of the diner meeting that had just quietly signed the next chapter of his life, Marcus Doyle sat parked outside the Bennett family clinic in his truck, watching the building through the rain-streaked windshield with the same guarded suspicion he'd carried since the night he'd first warned Nate about trusting a stranger too quickly. He'd told himself he was only checking the perimeter, old habit, the kind of vigilance that had kept both of them alive this long, but if he was honest with himself, some part of him had also come to watch Grace, to see with his own eyes whether the woman Nate had grown so unguarded around deserved even half the trust she'd been given. He watched her lock up the clinic at the end of a long day, exhaustion written plainly across her shoulders, and was ready to drive off, satisfied enough with nothing incriminating to report, when a battered station wagon pulled into the lot, instead headlights cutting weakly through the drizzle. A woman climbed out, thin and worn in a way Marcus recognized instantly from a childhood spent around people stretched too thin for too long. A small boy asleep against her shoulder, his breathing audibly labored even from where Marcus sat. "I'm so sorry," the woman said, her voice cracking as Grace hurried back to unlock the door she'd just closed. "I know you're closed. I didn't know where else to take him. His fever won't break and I don't have insurance. I can't afford the emergency room. Hey." Grace's voice was gentle, immediate, already reaching to take the boy's weight from the woman's exhausted arms. "You did exactly the right thing coming here. Let's get him inside." Marcus watched through the rain-streaked glass, unable to look away, as Grace worked with quiet, practiced calm, checking the boy's temperature, listening to his labored breathing, murmuring reassurance to a mother clearly on the edge of collapse from fear and exhaustion both. It took the better part of an hour before the fever finally broke, and the boy's breathing eased into something steadier, the small clinic lit only by the single lamp Grace had left burning after hours. "Thank you," the mother said, gathering her sleeping son back into her arms, already reaching into a worn purse with trembling hands. "I know it's late. I know you're closed. Please let me pay you something. Anything." "You'll do no such thing," Grace said firmly, closing the woman's hand gently back around whatever crumpled bills she'd been offering. "This clinic exists so kids like him don't go without care, because their parents can't afford it. That's the whole point. Get him home, keep him warm, and if the fever comes back, you call me directly. I mean that. Any hour." Marcus sat frozen behind the wheel of his truck, watching the exchange through rain that had begun quietly to soften. He thought of every warning he'd given Nate over the past weeks, every accusation, every careful, suspicious calculation about what a woman like Grace Bennett might really want from a man worth as much as Nathaniel Coleman. He thought of his own words delivered with such certainty in that midnight kitchen conversation. Anyone can say no to money once, especially if they suspect there's more coming if they play it patient. He watched Grace lock the clinic door behind the departing woman, watched her lean her forehead briefly against the cool glass, exhausted in a way that had nothing performative in it, nothing calculated for an audience she didn't even know was watching from the parking lot. Something in Marcus's chest, guarded and suspicious for as long as he could remember being useful to anyone, quietly, unexpectedly came undone. He thought of his own childhood, the particular hunger, the particular cold, the years he and Nate had spent learning exactly how rare it was to encounter kindness with no strings quietly attached to the underside of it. He had spent weeks looking for the strings on Grace Bennett, watching her now alone in an empty clinic at the end of an exhausting day, giving away care she couldn't afford to give away to a stranger who couldn't pay her back. He understood all at once, and completely, that there weren't any strings to find. He started the truck's engine and pulled slowly out of the lot, already composing in his head the very different conversation he owed his oldest friend, an apology long overdue for every ounce of suspicion he'd poured onto a woman who had done nothing this whole time but exactly what she claimed she would. He had no way of knowing yet, driving back through the wet Kentucky dark, that the very thing he'd spent weeks trying to protect Nate from had already been sold days earlier in a roadside diner 2 counties over, and that the quiet, fragile peace they'd all three built together was now running on borrowed time neither of them could yet see the edges of. The Voss estate's private wing had been converted over the course of several careful weeks into something closer to a stage set than a home. Folders of documents fanned across the study's long table, a corkboard of photographs, pinned in careful rows, a woman's entire fabricated childhood assembled with the same cold precision Diane Voss brought to every acquisition she'd ever made. Again, Diane said, not looking up from the folder in her hands. From the beginning, your grandfather's name. Madison sat across from her mother in the lamplight, dressed down for once. No makeup, hair pulled back, the deliberate plainness of rehearsal rather than performance. General Thomas Reeves, she recited flat with exhaustion. Decorated for valor in 1968. Married to Eleanor Reeves. Their only daughter ran away at 19. Cut off contact, was presumed to have died somewhere out west without ever having children of her own. Until now. Until now, Diane repeated, satisfied, closing the folder. The birth certificate is done. The adoption paperwork took considerably more effort, but a retired county clerk with gambling debts is a wonderfully cooperative resource. The photographs are the only piece left that requires your attention. She slid a manila envelope across the table. Madison opened it to find a series of digitally aged photographs herself, as a child, seamlessly inserted into old family portraits, a technology so advanced now that even Madison, staring directly at the doctored images, found it difficult to locate the seam where fabrication met reality. This is insane, Madison said quietly, though not for the first time. Even if it works, even if they believe it, what happens when someone actually looks closely? DNA testing exists, Mother. People will ask, and we will have answers ready for every question before it's fully formed, Diane said, unbothered. General Reeves is 83 years old and has spent 40 years praying for exactly this outcome. Grief makes even careful men careless, Madison. He will want to believe you long before he has any reason to doubt you, and by the time doubt might otherwise take root, we will already control everything that matters: his fortune, his name, and the social standing that opens every door currently closed to this family. And Coleman Bourbon Co. Something shifted behind Diane's composed expression, the faintest crack quickly smoothed over of an old and much deeper motive than simple ambition. That, she said carefully, is a separate matter entirely, and one that is finally, after considerable delay, moving toward resolution. Madison studied her mother for a long moment, some old childhood instinct recognizing the particular stillness in Diane's voice that always preceded something far darker than she was willing to explain fully. What did you do? What I always do, Diane said, rising from the table, ending the conversation with the same finality she ended everything. I finish what needs finishing. Learn your lines, Madison. The gala is in a few short weeks, and General Reeves will not be kept waiting a moment longer than necessary. Several miles away, in the small kitchen above the Bennett family clinic, Grace stood at the counter reading a letter that had arrived unexpectedly in that afternoon's mail. An invitation embossed and formal to a charity gala being hosted by the Reeves family in honor of General Thomas Reeves's upcoming birthday, the proceeds benefiting rural healthcare initiatives across the county. Someone at the county health office must have put the clinic on a donor mailing list, she said, half to herself, turning the heavy cardstock over in her hands. I can't imagine why else I'd be invited to something like this. Nate, seated at the table with a mug of coffee gone cold in front of him, went very still at the mention of the name. Reeves, he repeated carefully. As in General Reeves. You've heard of him. Everyone in this state's heard of him, Nate said, though something in his voice carried a weight that went beyond simple regional fame. War hero. Old Kentucky family. There've been rumors for years that he's been searching for a lost granddaughter, some daughter who ran off decades back and was never heard from again. It's the kind of story that shows up in the local paper every few years, whenever there's nothing else to print. Grace set the invitation down slowly, something uneasy stirring in her without quite understanding why. That's sad, she said. 40 years looking for someone who might not even want to be found, or someone who never got the chance to look back, Nate said quietly, and something in the careful, deliberate way he said it made Grace glance up at him, catching an expression she couldn't quite name. Not simple sympathy, but something closer to recognition, as if the story had touched a nerve he hadn't expected it to touch. Neither of them said anything further on the subject that evening. But later that night, long after Nate had gone quiet in the next room, Grace found herself pulling out the small wooden box she kept on her closet shelf, the one that had belonged to her mother, who died when Grace was too young to hold, onto more than fragments of memory, leaving behind almost nothing except a handful of photographs and an old military-issue locket. Grace had never once managed to open, its clasp rusted shut by decades of neglect. She sat on the edge of her bed, turning the locket over in her palm the way she had 100 times before, without ever finding the patience or the tools to force it open, Some old superstition always stopping her, a sense that whatever it held belonged to a version of her mother she'd never gotten to know, and that opening it might somehow make that absence more permanent rather than less. Tonight, for reasons she couldn't fully explain even to herself, she carried it downstairs to the kitchen, instead working the clasp gently under the light with a thin flathead screwdriver from the clinic's supply drawer patient in. The same careful way she approached a stubborn suture. The clasp gave finally with a soft click. Inside, folded so small it had survived decades untouched, was a photograph, faded, creased along old fold lines, but unmistakable even in the dim kitchen light. A young man in dress uniform, a woman beside him in a simple summer dress, and between them, held carefully in the woman's arms, an infant Grace had no way of identifying by name, though something in the shape of the woman's face, the particular set of her eyes, struck a note of recognition. Grace felt somewhere deep beneath conscious thought a resemblance so close to her own reflection that her hands began without her permission to shake. She turned the photograph over. On the back, in handwriting gone soft and gray with age, someone had written a single line, "Eleanor and Thomas with our girl before everything." Grace sat very still at the kitchen table for a long time, the invitation to the Reeves family gala lying open beside the locket, two pieces of an old mystery suddenly impossibly occupying the same small circle of lamplight. She thought of the story Nate had told almost offhand only hours earlier, a general searching 40 years for a granddaughter who'd vanished along with a daughter who ran away and was never heard from again. She thought of her mother who had arrived in Bardstown alone when Grace was barely more than a toddler, who had never once spoken of family, of where she'd come from, of anyone at all beyond the small, self-contained world she and Grace had built together in the years before her death. She thought, with a chill that settled slow and cold along her spine, that the woman in the photograph, young, uniformed husband beside her, an infant held close against her chest, looked less like a stranger from someone else's forgotten a story, and more with every passing second. She studied it like the mother Grace had spent her whole life barely remembering. Grace didn't sleep that night. She sat at the kitchen table until the sky beyond the window shifted from black to the deep bruised blue that comes an hour before dawn. The photograph propped against the sugar bowl where she could keep looking at it, as if enough looking might either confirm or dissolve what she thought she was seeing. She heard Nate's door open sometime past 4, his footsteps quiet on the stairs, the particular soft tread of a man who still even now moved through a house like someone trained, never to announce himself carelessly. He stopped in the kitchen doorway when he saw her. "You didn't go to bed?" "No." Her voice came out rougher than she expected. She slid the photograph and the locket across the table without further explanation, watching his face as he picked them up, as he turned the photograph over and read the faded handwriting on the back. He went very still. "Where did you get this?" "My mother's things." Grace wrapped both hands around a mug of coffee gone cold hours ago, needing something to hold on to. "She died when I was 6. I don't remember much about her, barely anything, honestly. She never talked about where she came from. I always assumed it was because there wasn't much to talk about. A hard childhood somewhere, no family worth mentioning." She swallowed. "I never once considered that she might have been running from something instead of just coming from nothing." Nate set the photograph down carefully as if it might shatter, and looked at her for a long moment with an expression Grace couldn't fully read, something between disbelief and a kind of dawning careful hope he seemed almost afraid to let himself feel. "Grace." His voice was quiet. "If this is what it looks like, I know what it looks like." She pressed the heels of her hands briefly against her eyes. "I've been sitting here all night trying to talk myself out of it, trying to tell myself it's just a resemblance, a coincidence, a locket that happened to end up in my mother's things for some other reason entirely. But the eyes," her voice cracked slightly, "the eyes in that photograph are my eyes, Nate. I've looked at them in the mirror my whole life." He reached across the table and took her hand, not saying anything for a moment, simply letting the weight of his steadiness settle into the space between them. "If General Reeves has spent 40 years looking for his daughter's child," he said finally carefully, "and that daughter turns out to have been your mother, then somewhere out there is a man who spent 4 decades grieving a loss he never had to actually carry. You could give him that back. Or I could walk into a gala full of strangers and hand a grieving old man false hope over a locket and a resemblance," Grace said, some old practiced caution rising up beneath the exhaustion. "I've had enough of watching people get destroyed by things that turned out to be lies, Nate. I'm not going to be the one who does that to him." "Then we find proof first," Nate said simply. "Real proof. Not a locket, not a resemblance, something no one can argue with." Grace looked at him for a long moment, something steadying in her at the quiet certainty in his voice, the way he'd said "we" without hesitation, as if there had never been a question of her carrying this alone. 3 days later, Marcus arrived at the clinic in the middle of the afternoon, uncharacteristically breathless, having driven the last 20 miles well past any speed a cautious man would normally risk. "We have a problem," he said before either of them could greet him properly. "A bigger one than I initially thought." He laid out what he'd learned in the flat, efficient tone of a man delivering bad news as quickly as possible to get it over with a contact still embedded within Voss Enterprises' security apparatus, someone Marcus had cultivated. Years back, during an earlier, quieter phase of corporate reconnaissance, had reached out with a warning. Diane Voss knew Nathaniel Coleman was alive, had known for weeks, and rather than simply exposing him publicly, which would have been the obvious, simple move for anyone with less patience than Diane Voss possessed, she was instead preparing something far more permanent. Men already dispatched instructions, already given time deliberately to strike before the upcoming Reeves family gala, when Nathaniel's continued existence might otherwise become inconveniently publicly confirmed. "She's not trying to expose you," Marcus said grimly. "She's trying to finish what almost worked the first time. And she wants it done before that gala, because once you're seen alive in a room full of witnesses, it becomes a lot harder to make you disappear a second time without questions. Nobody in her position wants asked." Grace felt the floor of the moment tilt beneath her old fear from the night on the distillery road, returning all at once, sharper now for how much more there was this time to lose. How does she even know where to find him? Marcus's jaw tightened, some old guilt visible beneath the urgency. "That's the other thing," he said. "The leak traces back to a freelance information broker who's been feeding intel to Voss Enterprises for weeks. I got a name." He hesitated, clearly reluctant to be the one delivering this particular detail. Caleb Hartman. The silence that followed was total, broken only by the clinic's old wall clock ticking steadily through a moment neither Grace nor Nate seemed able to fully process. Caleb. Grace repeated something cold and disbelieving moving through her. "He knew. He's known this whole time, and he sold it." "Sold you both in a sense," Marcus said quietly. "Whether he understood the full weight of what he was handing over, I genuinely don't know. But it doesn't much matter now. What matters is that we have very little time before Diane Voss's people move, and we need a plan that doesn't end with either of you disappearing permanently." Nate had gone very still throughout the exchange, something hard and focused settling into his expression, not the guarded fear Grace had grown used to over these past weeks, but something closer to resolve, a man finally reaching the limit of how much longer he was willing to keep hiding. "Then we stop hiding," he said finally. "We go to that gala. Both of us." Nate. Marcus started. "I've spent months letting this town believe I'm dead while Diane Voss quietly finishes tearing apart everything my family built." Nate said, his voice steady now in a way Grace hadn't heard from him before, something long buried finally surfacing. "And I've watched Grace carry a piece of her own history she never even knew she was missing, kept from her by the same kind of quiet, deliberate cruelty. I'm done letting her operate in the dark. If she wants a war, she can have one in front of every witness who matters." Grace reached across the small distance between them and took his hand, feeling the tremor beneath his outward calm, understanding in that moment exactly how much this decision was costing him. Not fear of Diane Voss alone, but the far old fear he'd confessed to her weeks earlier on the clinic's back steps. The fear of stepping back into the light and discovering once again that the people around him would only value what he could offer, rather than who he actually was. "You won't be doing it alone," she said quietly. "Neither will you," he answered. And something passed between them in that small kitchen. Old grief. Meeting old grief. Two people who had each spent a lifetime learning to survive in the shadows, choosing together to finally step out of for them. Behind them, Marcus watched the exchange with an expression that had shifted over these past weeks, from suspicion into something he hadn't expected to feel this fully. A fierce protective loyalty extended, now not just to his oldest, friend, but to the woman standing beside him, the one he'd once warned Nate against so relentlessly, and now found himself ready to stand between and any harm that came looking for either of them. "All right," Marcus said, finally exhaling. "Then we don't walk into that gala unprepared. We get proof of Grace's identity locked down before anyone else can bury it. We get security in place that Voss Enterprises doesn't know to look for. And we make sure that when the truth finally comes out in that room, it comes out on our terms, not theirs." Outside, the Kentucky afternoon had begun to soften toward evening, gold lights slanting low across the clinic's small parking lot, and for a moment, none of the three of them moved, each silently understanding that whatever came next would settle once and for all every secret that had brought them to this room together. The archive room at the county courthouse hadn't been touched in years. By the look of it, rows of steel filing cabinets under buzzing fluorescent light, decades of insurance claims and property records gathering dust in folders. Nobody had requested since long before digital storage made most of this redundant. Marcus had called in a favor to get after-hours access, the kind of favor that came with a promise never to mention it again. And now the three of them stood together in the narrow aisle between cabinets marked with decades Nate had spent most of his adult life deliberately not thinking about. "You're sure about this?" Grace said quietly, watching Nate's hands hover over the drawer marked with the year of the fire, something careful and reluctant in the way he held himself. "No," he admitted. "But if Diane Voss is willing to kill to keep her family's history buried, I want to know exactly what's in it before she gets the chance to bury it deeper." He pulled the folder. Inside, beneath a thin layer of dust, sat the original insurance claim filed on the Coleman family distillery in the weeks following the fire. A claim Nate had never once in 20 years thought to look for, having grown up, believing, as everyone in town had always told him, that the fire was a tragic accident. Faulty wiring in an old grain barn. Nothing more sinister than bad luck and old machinery. The claim told a different story. Buried in the adjuster's original notes, crossed out and amended in a second hand, was a notation flagging accelerant residue at two separate points of origin. Inconsistent. The original adjuster had written with an electrical fault. The notation had been struck through entirely in the final filed version, replaced with a simple conclusion: cause undetermined, insufficient evidence for further investigation. "Somebody changed this," Grace said, leaning over his shoulder, her voice gone tight. "Look at the signature on the amendment." Nate looked. The name meant nothing to him at first. A county attorney, decades retired now. A name attached to a firm that had, according to the letterhead, represented Voss family interests as far back as records in this room went. Something cold moved through him, understanding arriving in pieces too large to fully absorb at once. "My father wouldn't sell the land," he said, slowly. An old story surfacing that he'd only ever heard in fragments secondhand from relatives who'd known his parents before the fire. "There was a dispute years before I was born. The Voss family wanted to expand their own distillery operation onto Coleman land. My father refused. I always heard it mentioned like some old family footnote, a business disagreement nobody thought mattered anymore." His voice had gone hollow. "Nobody ever told me the fire happened 3 weeks after he turned them down for the third and final time." "Nate." Grace's hand found his arm, steadying him against something Marcus could see moving visibly through his friend's whole body. Old grief cracking open along a fault line none of them had known was there. "They didn't just take my company," Nate said, his voice low and unsteady now, years of careful composure finally giving way. "They took my parents. They took every year I spent in strangers' houses, every year I spent believing the fire was simply bad luck, some meaningless accident I had no one to blame for. It wasn't bad luck. It was them. It's always been them." Marcus, standing at the end of the aisle with a folder of his own pulled from a different drawer, went very still. "Nate, there's more." He held out a second file, thinner, more recent, pulled from a different section of the archive, entirely records related to a private investigation firm's billing history that Marcus had cross-referenced almost as an afterthought while searching for anything connecting Voss Enterprises to the fire. "I found this while I was looking for evidence about the fire," Marcus said carefully. "It's older than that. Goes back about 6 years. A retainer paid through one of Voss Enterprises' shell accounts to a firm that specializes in persuasion, the kind that doesn't leave fingerprints. Persuasion of who, Nate said, though something in his stomach had already begun to understand the answer before Marcus finished. The retainers dated the same month the takeover rumors first started circulating about Coleman Bourbon Co., Marcus said quietly. "The same month Vanessa left you." The room went very still. Nate stared at the file in Marcus's hands without taking it, some old wound he'd thought fully scarred over reopening all at once, raw and disbelieving. "You're telling me," he said slowly, "that Vanessa didn't leave on her own?" "I'm telling you Diane Voss paid someone to make sure she would," Marcus said, and something in his voice carried the particular gentleness of a man delivering news he wished badly he didn't have to deliver. "I don't have every detail. The paper trail gets careful after this point, like someone knew exactly how far to bury it. But the timing isn't a coincidence, Nate. She didn't just wait for you to be vulnerable and take advantage of it when the moment came. She engineered the vulnerability. She's been isolating you piece by piece for longer than either of us understood." Nate sat down slowly on an overturned filing crate, the folder still in Marcus's hand, his whole body gone still in the particular way of someone absorbing damage too large to process all at once. Grace crouched beside him, not saying anything, simply resting a hand against his back, letting him have the silence he needed. "My whole life," Nate said finally, voice barely above a whisper. I thought the worst thing that ever happened to me was random. Bad luck. A wiring fault nobody could have prevented. A fiancé who simply wasn't strong enough to love a man whose company looked shaky. He looked up, something fierce and wounded moving behind his eyes. It wasn't random. None of it was ever random. One woman has been quietly taking things from me since before I was old enough to understand what was happening. And I spent 20 years blaming an electrical fault and my own unlovability instead. You are not unlovable, Grace said fiercely, the words coming out before she'd fully decided to say them. Nate, look at me. Everything that woman did to you was deliberate cruelty dressed up as bad luck so that you would spend your whole life believing the problem was you instead of her. That's not an accident. That's a strategy. And it worked on you for 20 years because you never had a single piece of proof to argue against it. You have proof now. Something in Nate's face shifted, slow and unsteady grief and fury, and something else entirely, relief, maybe the particular relief, of finally understanding that an old wound had a cause outside himself, that the fear he'd carried for 2 decades had never actually been evidence of anything. Broken in him, only evidence of how thoroughly someone else had worked to make him believe that it was. She's not just trying to take my company, he said, finally standing slowly, something new and hard settling into his voice. She's been trying to finish something for 30 years. My father wouldn't hand over his land, so she took his life instead. I wouldn't hand over my company, so she took the people who might have loved me steady enough to help me hold on to it. He looked at Marcus, then at Grace, something resolute crystallizing behind his eyes. She doesn't get to finish it. Not this time. No, Marcus agreed quietly, closing the folder with a kind of grim finality. She doesn't. But she's got men moving before that gala, Nate, and now we know exactly how far she's willing to go to make sure it happens. We don't have the luxury of taking this slow anymore. Grace rose beside Nate, her hand finding his steady in a way that had nothing hesitant left in it. Then we don't take it slow, she said. We finish it together in front of every witness she's ever tried to keep from seeing the truth. Your parents, Vanessa, my mother running from something she never got the chance to explain. All of it out in the open where a woman like Diane Voss can't quietly bury it a second time. Nate looked down at their joined hands for a long moment, something in his chest finally fully unclenching after 20 years of carrying a grief he'd never once understood the true shape of. Together, he said. All of it. Outside the courthouse, the sky had gone the deep, bruised violet of early evening, the gala now only days away, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, Nate walked out into that fading light. Not as a man hiding from his own history, but as one finally ready to stand fully inside it. The Reeves estate had been transformed for the evening into something out of another era. White marquee tents strung with warm lights along the sweeping lawn. A string quartet arranged near the fountain, valets in pressed jackets waving town. Cars up the long gravel drive. General Thomas Reeves stood near the receiving line in his old dress uniform, 83 years old, and still holding himself with the ramrod posture of a man who had spent a lifetime standing at attention for things worth standing for, his wife Eleanor beside him, in pale blue, her hand resting lightly, hopefully, on his arm. Inside the main tent, Madison Voss waited near the small stage that had been erected for the evening's formal announcement, rehearsed, calm, arranged carefully across her features, though beneath it Grace, watching from the edge of the crowd in a borrowed navy dress. Nate, steady beside her, could see the faint tremor of a performance about to be asked to hold up under lights far brighter than any rehearsal had prepared it for. Ladies and gentlemen, Diane Voss's voice carried easily across the gathered crowd as she took the small stage, composed and radiant every inch, the gracious hostess. Tonight is a night General Reeves has waited 40 long years for. Tonight we welcome home a granddaughter he feared he would never find. Applause rippled through the tent. General Reeves's hand tightened visibly on his wife's arm. Hope and grief tangled so completely in his weathered face that Grace, watching from the crowd, felt something ache fiercely in her own chest on his behalf. Now Diane continued, smoothly gesturing Madison forward, before we finalize the paperwork this evening. I know the General will want to hear her story in her own words. Stop the ceremony. Nate's voice cut across the tent, clear and unhurried, carrying an authority that stilled the crowd instantly. Every head turning toward the man walking forward from the edge of the gathering, with Grace close beside him and Marcus, a careful step behind, watchful, scanning the crowd for exactly the blown kind of danger he'd spent the last several days preparing for. Diane Voss's composure didn't crack, not visibly, not to anyone who hadn't spent 30 years learning to read the smallest fractures beneath her control. But something in her eyes went cold and sharp as she watched him approach. "I'm sorry," she said smoothly, recovering with practiced ease. "I don't believe we've met." "We haven't," Nate said. "Not properly, though you've spent a great deal of money over the years making sure of that." A murmur moved through the crowd, confusion mixing now with the first electric current of scandal. "My name," Nate continued, his voice steady despite the visible effort it clearly cost him, "is Nathaniel Coleman." The name landed across the tent like a struck bell. Several guests actually gasped audibly. The missing Billionaire, presumed dead for the better part of a year, standing very much alive in the middle of a Reeves family gala. Cell phones rose throughout the crowd before anyone thought to stop them. "That's impossible," Madison said, her rehearsed calm finally cracking. "This is some kind of trick." "It's not a trick," Nate said, turning to address the crowd more fully now, something fierce and unshakable settling into his voice as months of careful hiding finally gave way. "I've spent the better part of a year in hiding because someone in this tent tried very hard to make sure I never had the chance to stand here and say what I'm about to say. I only recently learned exactly how far back that effort goes." He turned deliberately to face Diane directly. "All the way to a distillery fire 20-some years ago. All the way to a land dispute my father refused to settle in your family's favor." Diane's expression didn't change, but something behind her eyes had gone very still, very calculating, the look of a predator, recalculating the size of a threat that had just become considerably larger than anticipated. "I have no idea what you're talking about," she said, cool, and even though her voice had lost some of its earlier warmth. "I think you do," Nate said. "I have the original insurance claim, Mrs. Voss. The one with the accelerant residue notation that somebody in your family's employ crossed out and rewrote. I have records of a retainer paid to a private firm the same month my former fiancé left me, the same month rumors first started about my company's vulnerability. You didn't just wait for opportunities to take what you wanted from my family. You manufactured them. For 30 years. The crowd had gone entirely silent now, save for the faint, incongruous strains of the string quartet still playing somewhere near the fountain, unaware the evening had turned entirely. "This is slander," Diane said, sharper now, the first real crack showing beneath the composure. "Baseless accusations from a man who's clearly been through some kind of trauma and—" "There's more," Grace said, stepping forward beside Nate, her voice carrying clear and steady across the stunned crowd. General Reeves turned toward her, something in his weathered face sharpening with sudden, careful attention. "General Reeves. My name is Grace Bennett. I run a free clinic in Bardstown. And I believe the woman you're about to welcome as your granddaughter tonight is not your granddaughter at all." "How dare you," Diane snapped, but her voice had lost its earlier command entirely, now scrambling instead of directing. Grace reached into her small clutch and withdrew the photograph, walking forward and placing it directly into Eleanor Reeves's trembling hands. "This belonged to my mother," she said. "She died when I was 6. She never once spoke about where she came from. I found this locket in her things only a few weeks ago." Eleanor Reeves stared down at the photograph for a long, silent moment, her whole body beginning to shake. "Thomas," she whispered, turning to her husband, tears already spilling freely down her face. "Thomas, this is us. This is our girl. This is—" She looked up at Grace, searching her face with the desperate, hopeful intensity of 40 years finally reaching their end. "Look at her eyes, Thomas. Look at her eyes." General Reeves crossed the small distance between them with the careful, unsteady steps of a much younger man rushing towards something he'd feared he'd never live to see, taking Grace's face gently between weathered hands, studying her with an intensity that seemed to reach past the present moment entirely into something 40 years buried. "I served with men who'd have died for the chance to see this," he said, voice breaking. "You have her mother's face. You have my daughter's exact eyes. Test it," Grace said quietly, holding his gaze steady even as her own eyes filled. "Right here tonight in front of everyone. I don't want you to take my word for it. I don't want anyone in this family to spend one more day uncertain." It was at that moment, as a stunned crowd began murmuring as Diane Voss's carefully built evening collapsed in real time, before hundreds of witnesses, that Marcus's trained eye caught the movement near the tent's rear entrance. A man moving too deliberately through the crowd, one hand reaching beneath his jacket in a motion Marcus recognized instantly from years of exactly this kind of vigilance. Nate Marcus threw himself forward without hesitation, closing the distance in a single desperate stride, tackling the man before the motion completed itself, both of them crashing hard against a table of seated guests who scattered screaming as the confrontation spilled across the marquee floor. A blade clattered free across the flagstones, and for one terrible moment Grace thought Marcus had been hit, watching him go still beneath the struggling attacker before he rolled the man beneath him and pinned him firmly, blood running from a shallow cut along his forearm, but nothing worse. "I'm fine," Marcus gasped up at Nate's stricken face, breathless but grinning through the pain, adrenaline, and relief tangled together. "Told you I'd keep you breathing." Security swarmed the scene within seconds, restraining the attacker, while Diane Voss, understanding at last that the evening had passed entirely beyond her ability to control, went pale and silent, several guests already backing away from her, as if her proximity itself had become dangerous. "Call the police." General Reeves said, his voice carrying an authority 40 years of command had never fully left him. All of them. Everyone involved in whatever this evening truly was. Within the hour, on the estate's front lawn beneath flashing blue and red light, Diane Vossiho waiting patrol car in handcuffs. Her composure finally completely gone, replaced by a cold fury she made no effort now to disguise. Madison stood frozen nearby, her fabricated identity collapsing entirely under a detective's careful questioning. Tears, streaking mascara down, a face that had only hours earlier been prepared to accept a stolen inheritance in front of hundreds of guests. Grace sat on the estate's front steps beside Nate, a blanket someone had draped over her shoulders against the cool night air, watching the scene unfold with a strange hollowed-out calm that came from having just witnessed her entire understanding of her own history rewritten in the span of a single evening. "You did it," Nate said quietly, taking her hand. "You have your family back." "We both did," Grace said, looking over at him at Marcus nearby, getting his arm bandaged by a paramedic and waving off General Reeves's insistence on a hospital visit with an easy, exhausted grin. "None of us did this alone." Behind them, Eleanor Reeves approached slowly, still holding the photograph carefully against her chest, and knelt in front of Grace with tears still bright in her eyes. "Welcome home, child," she said softly. "We've waited so long." The weeks that followed unfolded slower than anyone expected. Grief and vindication settling into something calmer, something closer to an ordinary life than any of them had known in longer than they cared to admit. Diane Voss's trial moved through the courts with the kind of thoroughness that comes when evidence has been carefully, patiently assembled. The buried insurance claim, the shell account retainer testimony from the man Marcus had tackled to the ground, who gave up every detail of his employer's instructions in exchange for a lighter sentence. Madison, stripped of the fortune she'd been groomed to steal, cooperated fully once the weight of her mother's crimes became impossible to carry alone. Her own charges reduced to fraud, rather than conspiracy. Caleb's role surfaced early in the proceedings, his name printed in the county paper beside words like informant and complicit. The promised return to Voss Enterprises he'd traded everything for, having evaporated the moment Diane's empire began collapsing around her. Nathaniel Coleman had by then every legal right and every practical means to finish what the courts had started, to see Diane Voss's remaining businesses dismantled entirely, to make certain the family that had taken his parents, his fiancée, and nearly 2 decades of his life would never again hold enough power to threaten anyone else. He didn't. A few weeks after the sentencing hearing, he stood alone outside the courtroom, watching through a narrow window as Diane Voss was led away in handcuffs for the final time, her posture still rigid, still refusing to fully bend even now. Grace found him there, quiet in the hallway's fluorescent light, and didn't ask what he was thinking. She simply stood beside him, letting the silence hold whatever it needed to hold. "I could take everything that's left," he said finally. "Every dollar, every scrap of what she built. I have the standing to do it, and no one in this county would blame me." "Would it change anything?" Grace asked gently. "No," he admitted. "It wouldn't bring my parents back. It wouldn't undo 20 years of believing the fire was simply bad luck. It wouldn't make Vanessa's leaving hurt any less than it did at the time." He looked at Grace, something settled and clear in his eyes that hadn't been there in all the months she'd known him. "I think I've spent long enough letting Diane Voss decide who I become. I'd like to stop now. Not for her sake. For mine." He let the law take its course, instead, declining to pursue the additional civil claims his lawyers had drafted, redirecting his energy instead toward the parts of his life that had for the first time in years begun to feel entirely his own. That same season, Coleman Bourbon Co. welcomed its founder back publicly for the first time since the accident, the company's stock steadying within days under Nathaniel's renewed leadership. He used a portion of that first quarter's profits to fund a full renovation of the Bennett family clinic, new equipment, an expanded waiting room, a second full-time nurse hired so Grace would never again have to carry the weight of the whole building alone. He insisted the funding be public this time. No anonymous foundation, no careful distance kept between his name and the good it did. "Some things," he told Grace, echoing words that had once belonged to her father, "are worth putting your name on." Marcus recovered fully from the injury to his arm within a matter of weeks, wearing the thin scar afterward with the particular pride of a man who'd finally fully earned the trust he'd spent so long withholding. He stayed on with Coleman Bourbon Co. as head of security, though it became something of a running joke between the three of them that his real qualifications by then had far less to do with protecting the company than with having been wrong loudly and complete about the woman who would eventually become his closest friend. A year later, General Thomas Reeves stood at the edge of a small garden behind the newly renovated clinic watching his granddaughter finish her nursing certification with honors, Eleanor beside him dabbing quietly at her eyes. Grace had insisted on completing the coursework entirely on her own, refusing every offer of help even after her identity and the inheritance that came with it had been fully confirmed, and something in that stubborn insistence had by then become one of the qualities Nathaniel loved most about her. He proposed that same evening in the garden behind the clinic where they'd first sat together on the back steps months earlier. No cameras, no crowd, only the two of them, and the last light fading gold over the Kentucky hills. "You didn't fix me," he told her, kneeling in the grass, voice steady despite everything trembling beneath it. "I don't think that was ever something one person could do for another. But you stayed, long enough for me to stop waiting to be left. I don't know how to thank someone for that except to ask you to keep staying for as long as you'll have me." Every day, Grace said, tears bright in her eyes as she pulled him up to meet her. "As your equal. Not because you saved me, and not because I saved you. Because we chose each other over and over when it would have been easier not to." They married that autumn in Bardstown in a ceremony small enough to fit in the clinic's own garden, surrounded by the town that had watched a nurse rise from nothing and a hidden man finally learn how to be found. There's a lesson in this story worth sitting with long after the credits of a life like theirs have finished rolling. It's the lesson that kindness given without expectation of return has a way of finding its way back to you, sometimes years later, in forms you never could have predicted. It's the lesson that wealth and power mean very little if they're built on the ashes of other people's suffering, and that the truest measure of a person isn't what they have, but what they're willing to give away without keeping score. It's the lesson that healing rarely comes from grand gestures. It comes from someone simply choosing day after day to stay. It's the lesson that the people who hurt us out of their own fear and greed do not get to decide forever who we become afterward. That forgiveness, when it's offered, is very often less a gift to the person who wronged us and more a gift we finally give ourselves. And it's the lesson that family isn't only the blood we're born into. It's the people who show up in a ditch in a storm in the darkest hour of our lives and simply refuse to leave. What lesson did you take from this story? Which moment stayed with you the longest? The gate, the ditch, the courtroom, or the garden? I'd love to know. Leave a comment below and share your thoughts with everyone watching. If this story moved you, please take a moment to like this video. Share it with someone who needs a reminder that kindness always finds its way home. Leave a comment below and subscribe to this channel so you never miss the next story. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next video.